Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be talking to Professor T.J. Demos, who is the founder and director of the Center for Creative Ecologies, situated within the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of Santa Cruz. I'm told that you're also now the distinguished visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, which is where we are located, and on behalf of whom this conversation is being done, primarily through the Visual Identities in Arts and Design Research Center, and particularly the BioArts program. Now, Professor Demos, as I said to you earlier on, this is a very daunting conversation for me because of the range of concerns and their terrifying currency, actually, that I feel to be central. And in this regard, forgive me for being craven, I regard you as one of the most significant current intellectuals in your field because of the way in which you express absolutely pressing matters which define the 21st century and the crisis we are living in. In your book, your most recent book, Radical Futurisms, you explore the fact or matter that we are living at the end of democracy, of liberalism, of capitalism, of a healthy planet, of the Holocene, of civilization as we know it. Could you please unpack that damning accusation?
Sure. Well, that book came out of several other projects that preceded it and helped prepare for it, where I was thinking about a lot of that stuff, along with many other people. Theorists and philosophers and people writing about politics and ecology and art. So in many ways I was bringing them together to foreground them as a set of questions that could motivate the research that went into that book. And yeah, it's what we might call a polycrisis. There's a series of crises that are occurring these days that I think are more or less, most people are aware of this, that are continuing to intensify actually. And so that led to the question, if we're living at the end of all of these different formations, what comes next? Where is this heading? And I turned to artistic and creative practices to think about that and to look at how people were understanding this. So if I can just back up a little bit.
Sure.
One way to articulate this ending is to think about the end of the future itself. We've entered into this stage where it seems like there's no alternative. This has been going on for a long time. It's like this is I'm thinking of the Thatcherite slogan, "There is no alternative," that she articulated in the 80s already. And for recent political theorists and writers like Mark Fisher or Franco Berardi or many others, Mark Fisher proposed this idea that we're living during the time of the slow cancellation of the future, meaning culture and historical development have reached a point of stasis where they're no longer, we're not experiencing anything new. It's just the intensification of this locked-in condition of a kind of decrepit capitalism, and the very idea of an alternative seems ever fleeting. And so I wanted to take issue with that proposal and again have recourse to a lot of creative practitioners and artists and musicians who are thinking about this and actually are doing an enormous amount of imaginative thinking about what a future could be. So I found that actually there's, this is a site of almost a flourishing of ideas around this. And so those went into the book Radical Futurisms from mainly artists who are working out of what I call, after the German Jewish theorist Walter Benjamin, traditions of the oppressed. So working in conditions of the long history of racial capitalism, of anti-black slavery, of indigenous genocide and displacement, largely from within the Americas and also with some reference to Europe. That was my geographical framework for that book. But within that, there's lots of thinking about futurity and futurisms. This is a term that is taken up explicitly by some groups, like Black quantum futurism. It has a long history in terms of Afrofuturisms and Indigenous futurisms and many other different kinds of how, artists who are asking, what could the future be? What would that look like? How can we get there? And how does it differ from conditions of past oppressions?
It seems to me, listening to you, that the whole concept of time is altered. We can't think anymore, it seems, of the synchronic in relationship to the diachronic. Or we can't think in terms of beginnings, middles, and ends, or the idea of theatre operating in that way. Because two things are happening. One, there's a collapse of memory. This could actually be medical, not only psychological and historical. Mm-hmm. And then there's at the same time an impossibility to anticipate a future. And that's tied very much to fatalism and the dangers of authoritarian thinking, the inability to alter and change. So what you're producing is something so much more rewarding and healthy, is the belief in radical futurisms, a multiplicity of possibilities. And that is there as a way to counter what you see as an intensifying polycrisis. What I'd like to know, because of your passion for the arts, just to speak about some examples of artists or artworks that are taking up the positive vision that you uphold.
Sure. So the idea of radical futurisms, maybe I should just quickly elaborate on what I have in mind there. Radical is a challenging term to think of these days, and I have a number of different references for that. One is the Black radical tradition, which is very important within the US context of resistance struggles going back decades to conditions of racial capitalism in the States. And there's a lot of thinking that draws on, say, Black Marxism and forms of abolition of slavery, but also now continuing into the present in terms of the abolition of mass incarceration as a site of racial terror, policing, and oppression that has been long, it's been developed slowly over time. It goes back to a terrible history, but is actually intensifying these days under new conditions of authoritarianism or Trumpist late fascism, actually. So radical has relationship to those traditions. It has a relationship to indigenous resurgence. There's been a lot of political radicalism in terms of groups thinking about anti-extractive politics, anti-indigenous racism. The group, the Red Nation, has been an important point of reference for me, who's thinking about a kind of indigenous communism, ultimately, that's resistant to or opposed to conditions of current authoritarian capitalism. And then there's the ecological references to the radical. Etymologically, the term comes from an association with roots, so going to the roots of things, both in terms of like getting beyond surface analysis to a structural investigation, and like Angela Davis points to that definition herself, like how can we get to the roots of things structurally, like in terms of systems thinking. But also thinking about the ecological elements. How can we return to the roots? How can we think about roots and rooting? How can we think about the more than human realm of the environment and ecology in a way that connects all of these different intersections? So there's the ecology of the more than human, but there's also the ecology of human political and economic and technological systems. So I'm trying to bring all of those together in an intersectionless manner under the term radical futurisms. So some groups that, some artists and groups that I'm thinking about in that book that point to specific practices. I begin with a discussion of an Indigenous artist based in Toronto from Plains Cree First Nations, who's called T.J. Cuthand. And this is an indigiqueer artist who's working with Indigenous science fiction and post-apocalyptic scenarios, ways of world building through filmmaking. And he does these short videos asking the question, what comes after the end of the world? Like, imagine a near future where white colonists leave the earth, and because it's been destroyed over centuries of extractive capitalism, and they fly to Mars and start to colonize Mars and leave a broken earth to indigenous survivors. He made that just a few years ago, and it turns out it's ever present, and especially in relationship to the billionaire space race, Elon Musk wanting to occupy Mars. So it's an amazing film, and it's premised on that idea, and it looks like a series of interviews with indigenous survivors, maybe a few decades into the future, who are beginning the process of reclaiming the earth. And it's called Reclamation. And this, I find, is an incredibly inspiring film based within indigenous radical futurist imagination that's reflecting on the ecological but also the economic and technological crisis. There's some references to that in the film, but also thinking about what the future could be beyond ultimately racial colonial capitalism. The speakers are talking about how they're reinventing conditions of life. There's no more money economy. You can't Google Earth. Google doesn't exist anymore. They're reclaiming good relations with the Earth through cultivating the planet, cleaning things up, trying to get rid of toxicity, and develop new kinds of communal, anti-oppressive or non-discriminatory relations between people. So all these things, for me, it's really amazing to see a kind of enactment of that idea of intersectionalist ecology that I'm trying to get at. That's just one example. There's many others. I mentioned Black quantum futurism and the way they're thinking about time and temporality. You mentioned the complexification of past, present, and future. They're very much doing that both through reference to Afro-diasporic traditions, like thinking about Dogon cosmology, but also bringing it together with quantum field theory and recent research within the sciences on quantum theory, which problematizes the strict separation between past and present and future. So how can we think about retrocausality? How can we think about the idea that the past is never simply past? Things can change and shift, and there can be new forms of agency within thinking chronopolitically, or the politics of time. How can we be in time otherwise, so that we're not simply, they're asking, as African American artists and theorists and writers and musicians, how can we escape from the ways in which time, or conceptions of time and practices of time, can oppress us? So how, this is a key idea in the book that I develop in relationship to practices like this. What would a temporal emancipation be? For African Americans, like Black quantum futurism, it means escaping from some of the stereotypical regimentations of Black ways of being in the world, or capitalist forms of clock time. The time of labor and its exploitations. How can we imagine other kinds of temporalities, like dream time, or the time of intimacy, or the time of memory, in ways that are connecting past, present, and futures, and reinventing the possibilities of worlds to come beyond this idea of the slow cancellation of the future.
Right. What's striking about what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, I think it's in the phrase retrocausality. How does one hold on to what is best in histories of resistance? that have been repressed through dogmas like there are no alternatives?
Yeah, it's a great question. Another art group that I look at in the book is called the Autolith Group. They're based in the UK. They come out of a black, Ghanaian, and British Indian background of the artists, Kojo Eshun and Angelica Segar. And they have this term that they use that I've found deeply inspiring called past potential futures. Like, how can we get at past potential futures? In other words, futures that were imagined in the past that were never fully realized, yet still have potential for altering the future. So their work in many ways attempts to develop an archaeology of the future through looking at the sites of potentiality from history, like tricontinentalism, like the anti-apartheid movement, like the movements of decolonization that were never realized, that fell, unfortunately, into new forms of neocolonialism in different places and for different reasons. So those histories of radicalism, though, aren't fully lost, right? So that's where it becomes important to have a practice of memory that's returning to them, to enliven them so that they might do work in the present in terms of helping us guide our way to a different kind of future. So I think that's really an important idea, and it resonates with a lot of artists. So when I talk about futurisms in my work, it's always deeply historical. I'm not really dealing with any practices that are proposing to simply reinvent the future from scratch, right? It's not dealing with a tabula rasa. It's always closely tied, like materially embedded within histories of struggle.
That sense of history, and because it's a kind of counterweight to something people might seem to suggest is evident in your work. I initially thought this, but I think I'm wrong. Wow, this is utopian. But it isn't, because to say something's utopian is to say that it's something that is deferred, it's a deferred possibility, it's not a practical reality. But what it is you try to do in this idea of radical futurism is show through artistic practice how the future can be and is being realized in the present. And that is the kind of battle against the fatality that is dominating world culture, the impossibility of change, the rule of law, the conditions of oppression being absolute. And finding those counter moves. And what I initially saw as utopianism was really about those radical, counterintuitive underground drives that happen in many societies across the world. And holding fast to those and celebrating those and foregrounding those, I think, is one absolutely vital way to restore a certain kind of value to humanity. And that's how I've understood it from my reading.
Yeah, I think that's right. As well as maybe some of your initial reservations or skepticism about that kind of position, which I also share at different times. But I think, thinking about my work in the past, it has been more or less at different times kind of unapologetically utopian in some ways. Yeah, so I'm insisting on writing in the name of hope.
Right.
And that could be read as naive or escapist or idealist. And I've really struggled with that because I don't want to collapse into the opposite and simply accept pessimism. And there's lots of temptations. I completely understand the temptations to do that these days. And there's lots of cultural, intellectual, theoretical, philosophical movements that are trying to define that position. I'm thinking of like Afro-pessimism, looking at the institutions of modernity and coming to the conclusion that there's no possibility of justice, of escape from these conditions of oppression. Slavery in the US, for instance, existed, and according to some, continues to exist, in an entirely legal environment, right? This was understood to be justified, correct, ethically true, and destined and justified legally. Those institutions are still very much with us. So an Afro-pessimist position is like, how can we free ourselves from the burden of utopian emancipation and work within these real conditions of the existence of oppression and find other ways to defy and think about forms of resistance to these systems, which you might say is a kind of hope, and some do. But like to get more into this, so I recognize that a utopian position is, for one, it's fundamentally against the idea of the notion that there is no alternative, right? So it's resistant to a Thatcherist position, which is itself, and I'm using Thatcherist more broadly, like a neoliberal capitalist notion that capitalism itself represents the end of history. There's nothing beyond that. This is the true and right way human affairs should be run and mediated. So there's an idea that that itself is anti-utopian. So if you take a utopian position against that, you're already, in a way, you're being anti-utopian. Right. And it gets increasingly more complex. But like this has a lot to do with my current work, where I'm trying to work through the problem of justice. And I realize, and part of this has to do with my own my own informal working methodology, which is continuing to grapple with issues that I recognize maybe in the past, in my own work, I've somewhat taken for granted, like the claim to justice, the notion of social justice. How can, I'm asking myself now, how might we rethink that? How have people already been thinking and challenging and problematizing the notion of justice? And there's lots of thinking about this right now. So this has to do with my current book, which is looking at contemporary art, the problem of justice and environmental violence, to think about how, again, artists and thinkers are considering this term in a way that takes seriously it's the real problems associated with it. The fact that justice, in some ways, is never realized. Maybe that's even its condition. But does that mean we should give up on it? Right. Not necessarily. But where does that leave us? How are artists thinking about this? How can we work ourselves through this problem, which is very much an engagement with, I think, in a kind of institutional urgency of our time? Like, I'm coming from the US. We have a government that is dedicated, at least in name, to justice. We have a Department of Justice, which I think is commonly understood to be a complete betrayal of justice in the name of, say, fascism or white supremacy or authoritarianism or forms of oppression. So, what does it mean to rethink justice after the failure of justice?
Rethinking justice after the failure of justice, and doing it by writing, thinking, and being in the name of hope. Because it's not only about writing, it's about living in the name of hope. That seems to be what I found most compelling about the positions that you occupy. Because it's through living this idea of hope. It's not just living proleptically, if only. It's about manifesting it now in one's actions and in one's being, in one's engagement. I think that's where a lot of the positivity and the enormous sort of admiration that has been garnered and directed towards you in the way you occupy your life. The thing here is in terms of the problem of justice, because unlike everybody else, we're all horrified by the escalating injustices around the world. And that produces a sense of hopelessness, of frustration or despair, because of the unbending arrogance of those who deem to rule the world over others, to determine the fates of others, to destroy other worlds, other countries. And so that There are obvious examples. The one that you've been working on recently involving a tragic image of a young boy's hand clasping a date palm plant in the midst of rubble. That is heartbreaking, but it's not only about the breaking of the heart that concerns you, but to do with how does one rethink justice in the midst of such an obscenity. Of course, I'm referring to Gaza. Could you please discuss that?
Sure. That's an image that was posted by the Palestinian artist and agriculturalist Vivian Sansour during maybe a few months into the genocide and ecocide in Gaza after October 7th, 2023. And she posted it and said, "This is what it means to be Palestinian today." So it's a horrific image. It's extremely disturbing. It's even just incomprehensible, the pain that it triggers, and what that represents and what it means, what it would be like to live in that or die in that condition. It's just absolutely horrifying. And yet this hand that reaches out is holding a date palm seed, a plant that's growing from the child's dead hand, otherwise buried in rubble. And Vivian Sansour sees this when she says that this is what it means to be Palestinian today. It's not simple despair, right? There's also this, as difficult as it is to think about, there's a sense of hopefulness in that image and in reposting it. Maybe that hope is most obviously defined by just the relentless struggle of life to exist, even within conditions of genocide. And I think that that's what Vivian Sansour is pointing to. What she would say, and other Palestinians might point to, is this term samud, or this term of Palestinian steadfastness, that simply their lives, will not be extinguished. And so there's something in that image that's extremely pointed, that is articulating the ultimate necessary failure of the genocidal project, that this will not work out, that there will be Palestinian becoming and emergence within even these conditions. So that for me was extremely moving, and I wanted to say something or position myself or think about conditions of Palestinian cultural practice in relationship to Gaza. I've written about Palestinian artists a number of times before over the last 20 years, so it wasn't entirely new, but this was a new level of intensity of the Zionist settler colonial project of erasure, of Palestinian erasure. So I wanted to do that, and again, not allow myself, as Palestinians don't allow themselves, to give up and see this situation as just one of simple despair or ontological terror, as if there's nothing else there. No, the struggle continues, and in her work, it speaks to her own struggle within, say, the relation of the larger framework of the Israeli imposed engineered famine that's still playing itself out right now. So she saves Palestinian heirloom seeds that have deep cultural roots within Palestine, distributes them to Palestinian farmers who are working and operating in the West Bank largely, and grows the seeds within her traveling kitchen project, and hosts meals for people to come together and talk about seeds, Palestinian farming, ways of reconnecting and maintaining a relationship between Palestinian life and the land, which is exactly the target of settler colonial erasure. And so that takes on reverberations with that image, that very difficult image that she posted in Gaza. And even though there's extremely different contexts of of environmental and social violence, ecocide and genocide within different parts of Palestine, whether we're talking about Gaza or the West Bank or East Jerusalem. There's broadly a sense of solidarity, and her work is really speaking to that. So yeah, hope is maybe in some way, maybe biopolitically, it's a matter of life and just the steadfastness of life to continue living.
TJ, I find you absolutely remarkable, because when I was thinking about this, I mean, I cracked, and I was thinking about Edward Said and what he would think about the conditions now, and the level of obscenity that we're witnessing. And then there's the other issue of we on the outside, media saturation, what I think is called, I think you might have termed it war pornography, but using the media as a means to expose and overexpose, make more than visible the grotesque, how we literally imbibe this, and to what extent does it change our lives? To what extent will would radicalize us, make us better people, kinder people? I think that seems to be one of the core driving forces in your life and your writing. I was also thinking, we mentioned before this official conversation, I mentioned somebody I absolutely adore who's a colleague of yours called James Clifford. So I'm thinking about that humanist tradition that is so strong that you're a part of. So as you said, memory and history is a great source of inspiration as we move ahead, as we try to hold on to hope as a viable sort of principle for being. Especially, or rather the point in this phrase here, the mediation power, grief and hope. The tensions in these spaces. This is more the complexity of the human condition at the moment, as I understand it. It's there in that matrix, power, grief, hope. And it seems this is what is making your writing so critical and so vital worldwide, is because how to do it without writing a manifesto? How to do it without making large sort of claims? In fact, the word that's attached to your writing is that it's, and I think it's right, it's healthily speculative. Is it a new kind of dogma? But without the French post-structuralist sophistry, without the hemming and hawing, you're trying to make terms work, but in quicksand. Did I understand that correctly, or how do you position yourself when you write? I mean,
it's interesting, and maybe I can speak about in some ways like why I would not write a manifesto, even though maybe I do make some big claims in my work, but it's always, I feel, along with others and in solidarity with broader collective projects of radical thinking. Not just with people and colleagues like Jim Clifford, who's amazing, and I feel really lucky to be able to have conversations with him, and I should say the broader intellectual context in Santa Cruz, where part of the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I'm at, has some amazing traditions. Specifically, the History of Consciousness program that he helped found, that people like Donna Haraway teach at. Angela Davis was there. Artists like Victor Bergam. There's a whole feminist science studies people. Karen Barad is there. Anna Singh is related to this. There's some amazing discourse around environmental studies, feminist science studies. There's a research center called Science and Justice. The larger intellectual project of cultural studies. Jim Clifford's relationship to Stuart Hall and bringing that kind of methodology into the mix in a kind of post-disciplinary or interdisciplinary way of thinking broadly with other people. That has always been deeply inspiring for me. And so, a manifesto, I couldn't ever imagine myself writing something like that. It couldn't. I don't think it could or should come from one person, right? Like this is something I always try to, when it comes up, to make clear in conversation that it's like when it comes to people who are looking for answers, like that's not how I think of my work. I want to open up the speculative horizons, yes, but I don't mean to provide any answers. I do try to make arguments, but any answers has to be a collective project, I think. There's a well-known African-American poet and writer, Claudia Rankine. She wrote her recent book is called Justice, or Just Us. And she begins the book by saying, there is no justice, there's just us. I think that's a perfect crystallization of a methodological project. We could think about what is justice? We could start to define it, like justice means this, this, and this. No, right? Within the practice of justice, there has to be a procedural element of justice in process. This has to be something that we work out together, and that will inform the ideas that we come up with together. It has to be a collaborative working through of ideas in progress and in a collaborative way. So yeah, that's how I'm thinking about things. And similarly, in terms of justice, like justice is such a complex idea. If justice typically follows from grievance, so that's often when it comes up when we talk about justice is when there's been some injustice that's been done. Justice also carries with it the ultimate impossibility of redress. There's forms of injustice. The most obvious kind is, say, death, right? Someone who's killed in an unjust manner, or someone who's experiences violence, that will never be repaired. There's no justice for the dead in some ways. So justice carries with it not only the promise of redemption, but also the impossibility of ultimate redress. So there needs to be a carrying of, say, a space of mourning, maybe to carry with it within the project of justice as it's developed within artistic practices. So I think that mourning is also a collective space. So we mourn together. It's important to have these understandings of mourning as relational. It's deeply relational. It's like maybe the site where compassion originates and forms of collective being together, but also the promise of a redemption. And that's something else that necessarily, for me at least, is collective. So I'm getting a little bit into my current book project.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it connects with what you were saying, I think, as well.
See, what I'm hearing here, you cannot escape mourning is an integral part of living. Loss cannot be overlooked in the name of some change. And I think about extremely saccharine thinking, like Alain de Botton's idea of empathy, which is such a neoliberal sort of idea of how one actually cures and heals oneself. What you keep returning to is the importance of the collective, of just us, of that as a key factor. But also, what I've witnessed at the moment, which I have major problems with, is the nature of divisive logic. Everything's oppositional. I mean, I think that's why I was trying to get at the non-position that you occupy as you shift, as you try to actually move across the trenches and try and get between all the counter logics that are happening, people screaming at each other, the death of dialectics. So what kind of conversation does one have now? And the only term I could think of when I was reading your work was actually the Nietzschean term of the extramoral, as a way to think outside of the dialectic, outside of its synthesis, the resolution of an opposition. To find another term, another way through to cut a new path, so for me that complexifies the idea simply of hope or of redemption, and asks us to realize that redemption and hope and mourning logged in a body in pain, in a body in transfiguration, in a body that's changing, that is the only way we can move ahead or endure now. And it's the kind of refusal of this kind of sense of being, this authoritarian belief in immunity, of being immune, somehow separate from suffering, somehow separate from the difficulties of life. It's the cruelty of that position and its disregard for humanity. In the context of South Africa, We all bemoan the complete inhumanity of the ANC, its complete disregard for the people of this country and primarily for the black majority. An absolute carelessness and disregard. So it's that callousness, the same thing I've witnessed in America when I was a student there many years ago, the complete callous disregard of the homeless, those in need of medical help, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because of this obsession with the capitalist ideal. Which is ruining the earth. And it's interesting that what you said here about, well, what you discussed earlier briefly about the idea of utopia. The thing is, the root meaning of utopia is no place on earth, whereas what you're actually concerned with profoundly is fixing the earth, repairing the earth, healing the earth. And I think that's one of the, and again, it's to just call it an ecological crisis and ecopolitics is just too simplistic, because the body, society, civilization, culture is all connected to the earth, and everything has to heal concurrently. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you mean it's not an ecopolitics in the sense that we can't reduce it to this simple site of practice or ideas, I agree. It's really, if you think about the environmental crisis in this tradition of the polycrisis, or give it the expansiveness that I think it necessarily requires, then it's just, as Naomi Klein writes it, this changes everything. If we're to think about this, what the kinds of care and reparations would mean in terms of this deep crisis that we're in. If it's a crisis of everything, of capitalism, of democracy, of liberal institutions, of Euro-American universalism, of technology, of ecology, then really this is nothing else than a necessary transcending of the deep, long history of racial colonial capitalism. Just to use a terminological emblem for what we're in. So, this is an enormous project. So, how do we think about that within our conventional forms of practice? I suppose this is why, art is important to me ultimately, because it's one of the, as far as I can see, it's one of the remaining areas of creative, speculative thinking that can be really open-ended and cross-disciplinary. And how else are we to think of addressing the crisis? Some of the problems of doing so within the sciences, for instance, or within engineering or design or economy. There's a tendency to become increasingly narrow and focused on what the problem is, which inevitably perverts the problem because it's collapsing it into just a kind of fictional construct of the crisis that we're dealing with. So within environmentalism, if we're just talking about carbon pollution within the atmosphere without talking about forms of inequality or structural racism or the capitalist economy on the ground, then we're participating within a kind of epistemology of division, of partitioning, that is itself doing a kind of violence to ways of thinking. So I suppose that's part of the, and this is by no means a simple or easy thing to do, but just the immense challenge of meeting the urgency of our times and how to do it within a space of creative, speculative thinking. I don't know how that's done. I mean, my resources are like sci-fi, like Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, some thinkers and writers within the U.S. context that I find really inspirational. Interdisciplinary thinking from a range of different perspectives, and the way that artists bring them together within a collective project. Like Jonas Staal, a Dutch artist who I think about in Radical Futurisms, is a good example of an artist who's not just thinking interdisciplinarily, but actually reconfiguring the practice of art as a form of bringing people together, like bringing, what would it mean to bring diverse collective projects together within a formal institutionalized context so that collective thinking can occur and forms of solidarity across difference can be realized, at least in a provisional way, as much as they can today, so that we can think about what the future, what a future post-catastrophe would be. And that raises all sorts of problems because we who are, all of us, who are based in different ways, different positionalities within the crisis, within a crisis that harms us all, again in different ways. We're all in many ways, broken subjects and effects of this tremendously violent system. How can we, given that positionality, even think about what a non-dominated way of being in the world would be? So this is, like, in philosophy, it's called like the non-identity problem. Like we can never, like from our subject position, never imagine what emancipation truly is. So Jonas Stalin, his work, and I deal with this in Radical Futurisms, thinks about this quality of futurity called the not yet. So the not yet is related to a world to come where it's not yet in an empirical way of understanding that configuration, but it's also unrealizable to some degree. It can only be realized through the process of what it will mean to get there. So it's very speculative, and there's some clear markers in terms of how we can produce a pathway. Like, we do know what systems of oppression look like and what we want to avoid. But in terms of a positive articulation of futurity, that is like deeply speculative and open. But that's the place of artistic creativity at its most ambitious. It's a kind of world building.
Because it's funny, when you were speaking earlier on, I was thinking about the American transcendentalists. I was thinking about Ralph Waldo Emerson and that sort of vision of transfiguring the world we're in, but imminently. Obviously, there are different influences there. Theology is a primary one. But then I was thinking that again as another antidote to what I see everywhere, which is absolutism. And absolutism is a symptom of a crisis. It's not a solution. But it's so staggering to see how it perpetuates itself across the world in various social systems, and how that is so starkly different to a position which I think one needs to take, which I think you call a non-identitarian position, a position that is hybrid, a position that is constantly shifting, a non-position if you get to Desiderius Erasmus. The non-positional is a vital answer, an antidote to identity politics, for example, to contrarian and oppositional logic, which is too... But the tyranny of capitalism is that it has invested us with mistaken ideas of identity. And it's rooted that problem, that disease, in our bodies. So it's impossible for people to think beyond how they've been named and constructed societally. And to free the human body from that burden is one of the greatest tasks, as I understand it. We take, for example, you talked about that appalling cognate African American, or one talks about black identity. As though it was something that were easily decipherable, as though black lives were self-explanatory. And there's a problem there, that basically one imposes a value system onto an oppressed peoples and supposes that this is the way forward. Now, for example, a placard that says, "I am somebody," is being made by somebody who's not recognized, not seen. And it's interesting then that, for example, there's the black resistance movements, it'll tap into the humanist tradition of identity politics, of resistance politics. But if one thinks about colonialism, for example, as a voiding of subjectivity, as an enslavement of being, as a collapse of agency, as an emptying of a being, instead of now trying to find an identity to counter that oppression, why not step deeper into the void? Step deeper into the unnameable, that which could not be contained, that which could not be bonded, and find through it, in that space, a space of liberty.
Yeah.
That's, but that's my obsession.
It's definitely connects to what I'm trying to think about as well, along with, for instance, the Autolith group. One of their films features in radical futurisms. It's called Infinity Minus Infinity, where they're in a way trying to think about that tradition of how blackness not only has been a site of colonization and the imposition of a form of valuelessness, and here they're developing this in relationship to the philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva, and some of her ideas of what the European Enlightenment tradition has done in creating hierarchies of whiteness and blackness, where whiteness is the universal measure for value, and blackness is considered valueless. And she interrogates that tradition in her really ambitious work, deconstructs it, and ends up with a kind of conclusion that you're getting at too, which is to reclaim valuelessness as a site of infinity, of beyond measure, of being beyond measure, that is a form of black emancipation. And I think that that's a radical proposition that helps us to see how identity politics and the crystallization of identity, or the stagnation of identity, starts to crumble. And I think that, like, from my understanding, the most compelling and interesting forms of black study, like Saidiya Hartman or Fred Moten, just a couple figures that I find really important, are also articulating that sense of blackness beyond definition, which is not to say that it doesn't exist and it doesn't have deep histories in the way racialization has occurred in all sorts of ways, but also acknowledges the ultimate fiction of race, and its really incredible complexity. But I also, like that, this is very philosophical. I try to develop this in terms of how artists are actually developing strategies and techniques of organizing, like real political organizing within the space of arts, to counter the divisiveness and the debilitating atomization of identity that can happen, especially within, I would call it liberal identity politics. This notion that we need to stay within our own, which is defined according to like race, class, or gender, whatever it may be, instead of thinking about identity politics in a radical way, the way that, say, Combahee River Collective, another group of African American feminists and lesbian queer thinkers, were doing so in the 1970s, thinking about identity politics as registering the significance of the way we've all been shaped according to the terms of gender, racialization, gender, sex, etc., but also insisting on that ultimate otherness or emptiness within ourselves that's always there, that's the truth of the subject, that can't ever be totalized or absolutized. And that creates an openness to relating to other people and difference, because that difference is the truth of ourselves. So this is, I think, really profound to think about. So Combahee River Collective, and they wrote a manifesto that's worth revisiting today. I think is a really useful way of thinking beyond the problems of identity. A book that does this really well is Assad Haider's Mistaken Identity, where he's dealing with the black radical tradition in relationship to its dalliances with identity over years, and the way that it's been seduced by identity, but also has rejected it and problematized it. He's trying to think about how organizing can overcome again this problem of identitarian divisiveness. I think that this is a major problem for organizing, which isn't separate from artistic practices, especially in this era of collectivism today, because a lot of artists are wanting to think about connections with others, developing communities, communities of care, but also political formations that might also connect to larger social movements, from Black Lives Matter to more. Indigenous revolutionary activities, anti-extractive formations. I think this is, to return to the term hope, this is indeed a place where we can think about hopefulness. I think that maybe is one of the few areas where there could be any sense of hope beyond the domination of late fascism these days, through social movements, not through other conventional forms of, say, electoral politics. As much as I think the running for mayor in New York of Zoran Mamdani who's the son of Mahmoud Mamdani,
yes.
a really important theorist of post or non-identitarianism, especially I'm thinking of his book, Neither Settler Nor Native.
Yes.
How can we get beyond this whole vocabulary, these terms, and the way these terms tend to ontologize identity, right? There's always the settler, there's always the native. No, how can we imagine a truly post-colonial space where we're exiting from those terms and the way of thinking of ourselves in those categories. Zoran Mamdani's run for mayor is a small. We'll see what happens in November, but this is indeed a hopeful kind of formation of social movements and electoral politics come together.
The primacy of hope seems to be the core theme of this conversation, and the defining inspiration in your thought and practice overall. When we were talking then about how to move beyond that, because there's massive identity fixation in South African culture and politics as well, as it is everywhere. But I was thinking as you were talking of Homi Bhabha, but I was also thinking of Frantz Fanon, and when he spoke about it is in the zone of occult instability that the people dwell and the revolution comes from. This idea of an occult instability, an occultation that is unstable, that shifts and changes. That level of mobility needs to be brought back into thought in spaces which are becoming increasingly deterministic. Even the humanisms, the humanities programs need to become more flexible. I think this is what your project is, to allow people a greater openness of thought, of thinking, is the key thing. The idea of neither settler nor native, again, it's that productive ambivalence. And as I listened to you, yes, I was thinking of the brilliant work by Homi Bhabha, but I was also thinking about French post-structuralism, which had a massive impact, productive impact on American thought, which is now being transmuted in your work into spaces that have become much more focused on activism, rather than a rarefied conceptual notion in a seminar room. That's why your emphasis on the collective and community projects. And then I was thinking when I was 17 at university, and the first essay I had to read was called The Death of the Author, I was completely nonplussed. The public school boy suddenly, what? I've been reading books written by people, Faulkner's, as I lay dying, and then suddenly I'm told the author doesn't matter. So the irony of that is that, in a sense, while your books are authored and the authorial voice is central, the voice is about the collective. There's a certain kind of way in which there's a mediumistic value that you give to thinking and being in the world. Would that be fair to say?
Mediumistic in the sense of vocalizing thoughts that are coming from elsewhere. Where there's a part of the authorial voice is a dialogical conversation that's being enacted with other artists and theorists and thinkers. I think that's true, yeah, but it wouldn't. I would want to include the citational ethics that goes along with it. So it's not a ventriloquism where I'm freeing myself from my own debts and lessons that I've learned from and with others, and I want to, surface that within my own footnotes and references, or within the text. I think this is very important to do. Lots of people are thinking about this these days. So yeah, it's a in some ways it's a voice that I wouldn't say or make any claims to be uniquely mine. In that sense, it is to some degree, like all of our voices, and this is a fundamental post-structuralist insight, right? Like I'm thinking of Bakhtin the word in language is always half someone else's. Yeah, that this is definitely true. In that sense, the author has died to allow the birth of the reader. This was definitely part of my intellectual formation in the 90s, and yes, post-structuralism was very important to that. And I worked with people who went on to be some of the leading lights within art history and visual culture in the States. Yet, in doing so, they became increasingly institutionalized. And though they were connected to radical political traditions and theories, in many cases ended up in a kind of elitist scholarly position within the university. And that's something I think that's distinguished my work and my struggle from theirs, as much as I learned from them. Right. In many ways. I've always had a foot outside the university, right, in social movements and activism and doing some political organizing, as well as bringing that within the university, which is increasingly necessary these days, yes, as we're seeing the collapse of universities into corporate capitalist structures of extraction. So I think many of us are trying to save what's there to possibly save within the university, not to give it up, not to simply abolish the university, as some activists might want to do. But I think we're at a time, again, Alberto Toscano talks about this in his book, Late Fascism, where this is this is not just some speculative possibility. This is happening in real material, economic, technological ways, from algorithmic governance to forms of militarized policing. So we have to think about, like, what does it mean to occupy, to be working in institutions, and how can we not only struggle to prevent their collapse into authoritarianism, yes, but also to rescue what's there. So to bring it back to Fanon, to bring it to a close in a way. The Wretched of the Earth, he ends that book by saying, we need to think about a new man. We need to think about how to produce a new man, which is post-colonial, and it does not rely on renovating or rehabilitating a European conception of humanity. We need to shed, we being, in his case, North African revolutionaries. How can those people think about shedding that inheritance, that colonial mimicry, to put it in Homi Bhabha's terms? Right. And I think, like, those of us who are opposed to racial colonial capitalism have to think about that today, and specifically in institutional terms. Like, how do we operate and create new futures within institutions that were formed within Western liberalism, which we know has been deeply complicit within the formation of what we're dealing with today, fascism or racial colonial capitalism? Like, what does that mean? This is a central question. And I think we in the institutions that are generally liberal domains, we can't have recourse to liberalism to avoid fascism. Right. I think we have to rethink the conditions from the ground up, maybe in the way that Fanon was suggesting.
I want to thank you so much, T.J. Damas, for your brilliant insights in a very controversial moment in which we're living in. And yes, I guess we need polyphony to answer against polycrises.
Absolutely.
Collective voices, but our own voices stridently in the midst of others, as yours. Thank you again for this conversation.
Thank you.